Hello everyone and welcome to IPAA's Virtual On the Couch series. My name's Kim Cheetah, a partner with PwC, and it's my great delight to have Acting Chief Executive Officer of the Department of Human Services, Lois Boswell, here to join us today. This is part of a series that we've been running with IPAA in order to enable some of the leaders of our departments and the public sector to really share some of the challenges that they've seen in these extraordinary times, but to also talk about leadership and to talk about the opportunities that this scenario creates for the public sector and for the state as a whole looking forward. Really important that I take this opportunity to acknowledge that Lois and I are sitting here today on the land of the Kaurna people. And wherever you're watching this or listening to this, take a moment to reflect on who the traditional owners are of the place where you're sitting today. And I'd like to pay my personal respects to the Kaurna people, to really recognise and acknowledge their custodianship of this land, their long traditional and spiritual relationship with this land, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and those who are carrying the mantle going forward. And I think that's particularly relevant as we sit here today. It's the start of National Reconciliation Week. It is Wednesday for Lois and I, which is also the 20th anniversary of the Bridge Walk, which is a really momentous time. A lot's been done in the last 20 years, but I think we'd probably both agree an awful lot more to be done. From an IPAA point of view, this series is done in partnership with a number of IPAA's important sponsors and partners, of which PwC is one, but also recognising Flinders University, the support of the Senior Management Council of Government, and also the Office for the Commissioner for Public Sector Employment. So with that start, Lois, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Kim.
I suspect it's been an extraordinary roller coaster. So exactly how many days was it that you took on the role of Acting Chief Executive that you suddenly found out the world had changed?
Yeah, well, and hasn't it changed? I feel like we're in the, what I'd call the COVID time warp. It feels like forever and it feels like yesterday. Time has taken on a whole different meaning in this pandemic and really changed things. So in thinking that through, in fact, actually, Jim McDowell, who's the head of DPC, was appointed Acting Chief Executive on the 6th of March, but was immediately called in to manage pandemic. So it was just within that week. So by the 13th, whilst I wasn't formally Acting Chief Executive, Jim was obviously doing other things. So we'd set up an incident management committee happening every day from then on. And as now we're down to once a week, but it certainly those first little while was a major roller coaster. I did try to take a long planned holiday on the 18th of March. It lasted precisely 2 days. Made it back into South Australia before the borders closed.
Well done.
And we was appointed Acting Chief Executive on the 22nd, and it's been quite an intense period since then. But actually, I've been extraordinarily impressed by, and I mean, I think South Australians should in fact be incredibly proud about the way we've managed this in general. And with working with the non-government sector and our own frontline workers, obviously Department of Human Services, unlike any other emergency service, we are the frontline in this one. So human services workers are the firefighters in a pandemic in many ways. Health workers are the front line and we're very close behind. And so that's been really interesting to see how you adjust an emergency management approach to something that's very different to the sorts of emergencies we're used to experiencing. And we've had to learn a lot and learn it very fast.
So with that, must have been a large number of challenges, but what were the most significant challenges that you faced as you sat down as a leadership team and said, the world has changed, what do we need to do to adapt?
Well, we had the many that everybody had, which was, oh my gosh, we can't actually be here anymore, let's get out of the building. And so we also, if you will recall, in the early days, there was the information about the actual virus was the thing that nobody had. And it was everything from, I mean, the buying of toilet paper is a pretty clear indication of that. You know, it was a different. There was a lack of understanding generally amongst ourselves, amongst frontline workers about what the virus was. So the first two challenges were really getting social distancing in place in an office environment, which is so not constructed for it,
Yeah.
and also getting people to understand what we were actually facing. So I do recall that I was going around the office saying, could you just get out of that office and have your meeting a little bit further apart for the first few days? And they'd go, oh, really? You want us to do that? And so we were running a lot of video broadcasts, a lot of webinars. We were running webinars with the sector, with the non-government sector, to try to provide information. But I also noticed that in running those webinars, we'd have people gathering together around their computers. So that learning about what did we have to do was quite an intense period at the beginning about what this virus meant. We also, and I'm very proud of the way the department stepped up. I think somebody has said to me recently that we've, saved hundreds of thousands of dollars and at least 3 years change management processes in the way that we've now been able to approach a virtual workforce. So we've actually moved 700 people out to working from home within a period of a couple of weeks, which everyone would have told you in government was impossible.
Yes.
Only 2 weeks before. So there was no doubt there were frustrations involved, but I want to thank the office staff who left to do that. That's been extraordinary. But also the IT crowd, because frankly, the frustrations, they did pull off a miracle.
Yep.
They would have had very frustrated people on the phone to them all day, every day. And I think that often in those times when things don't work and there's a person at the phone who you feel isn't actually getting it solved for you, we can all be a bit frustrated with that. So I do want to put a big yell out for the IT crowd who managed to pull off the miracles despite everything. We're going to have to go back now and put more effort into making sure we've got all the potential security gaps really covered, because when you do things that fast, you've obviously got to take risks that you would usually spend years planning against. But in the main, we got most people that were office-based workers working at home. But for our other workers, we obviously have disability support workers who work close to close with personal care with people every day. We have workers who work in our Safer Families program who go into houses to help vulnerable families and children. And they had to keep delivering services and step up and do those things despite personal fear about what it might mean to them and their family. And just like the health workers, those frontline workers, our frontline workers and the frontline workers throughout the non-government sector, I think we all owe a big thank you to, because not only were we saying everybody stay apart, we'd also had a pandemic that was creating extra social need, and we had to be the people supplying that extra social need. And those workers we've had people delivering food hampers into houses. We've had people on the phones all day, every day, answering questions about how to help people out of vulnerable situations. And we've had crying out for personal protective equipment, people delivering those services. Plus, and our youth facility, for young offenders, so youth justice, we've actually obviously had to have services provided there in a closed environment. So it's been a two-speed pandemic in many ways for everyone, I think. There's people who've suddenly found they had nothing to do and lost their jobs, and that's been extreme tragedy. And there's people who've suddenly found they've had way more to do. And we've experienced both sides of that just within the department itself.
And I'd like to personally put out my thanks and gratitude on behalf of everyone to all of those staff that have gone above and beyond, and also all of those non-government service providers that you work with and engage that also have been the front line. And we've talked a lot about doctors and nurses and how critical they've been in that time. But equally, right, as you said, right behind them have been all of those supporting community, supporting the social services that are fundamental, and even more so during such challenging times. Was one of those challenges around that issue of having a significant amount of staff who really had no choice but to be at work and providing that service because it was so critical, whilst you actually did have 700 that you were able to get from home, that almost difference in how you're able to actually deal with different staff, and that for those frontline staff, the option of working from home wasn't really an option?
And for our executive team and our incident management team, and we set up a special COVID response unit, we were all the time trying to hold those two messages and be able to acknowledge and honour both of them. So we're saying to people, if you can work from home, we want you to work from home, and we want you to look after yourself and your mental health in potential isolation.
Yeah.
But if you need to come to the workforce, we want to give you all the information. If you need to deal with people, because that's the job we're asking you to do, we want to give you all the information to be able to help and protect yourselves. And the critical partners in that has no doubt been the non-government sector. So one of the things we did early in the piece, because it started to dawn on me very much as I watched the State Emergency Centre process, is that all of our legislation and processes are set up for flood or fire or storm or environmental crisis. And this idea that, in fact, your intelligence comes from people on the ground. Actually, health absolutely were in the room, but other frontline services weren't really represented in that traditional model. We set up a non-government organisation intelligence group of chief executives, which we held twice a week at the beginning, and that was really useful. Once that kicked in and the information from those CEs about what was going on the ground was going into the State Emergency Centre, I'm told it changed the way the State Emergency Centre was able to assess the scenario. So we were seeing things like, because there were no eyes on the street, some of our service providers who were there doing 24/7 service were actually experiencing some crime issues for some of their staff. We were able to very clearly understand what the shortage of personal protective equipment out in areas were. We were able to give feedback about what rules that potentially stopped soup kitchens, which was, and to sort that out. And we were able to work out, the South Australian Housing Authority has done an amazing job, in fact, along with the Zero Project and non-government organisations, of getting a lot of people who are homeless off the streets and into hotel rooms, and now are moving to move them into more permanent accommodation. So that's actually been something that potentially could be a real positive out of this crisis. But that required real collaboration, and I absolutely take my hat off to all of the CEs who joined into that. We would have a half an hour meeting on Zoom with 18 people. So you've got to imagine that takes
That's bigger than the Brady Bunch.
And it's the Brady Bunch squares, and they move around, which is quite disconcerting, because in the interest of fairness, I would say, okay, we didn't discuss things, we just provided intelligence, then we took issues offline. Right. But in the interest of fairness, I went different ways around the screen in terms of who spoke when. But then the squares would move and I'd miss people. But it was very good to get that information. We also had a separate forum with the peaks of all the different non-government organisation streams, and we also had a forum with the disability service providers, because they obviously have accommodation services specifically, and we were trying to get good information to them and good information back to health about the real challenges for them, because it's a unique and different environment. There was a lot of messaging coming out from the Commonwealth about aged care and aged care facilities, but group homes for people with disabilities is a different environment and needs to have its own considerations.
Right. Okay. Those conversations you're setting up with the non-government sector and the peaks, I guess, too, you're starting to hear about their own challenges as organisations and some of the services that they've historically provided that they were suddenly being not able to do or not able to provide for different circumstances. Did that create a different challenge back for the government and the department, which is if the services that vulnerable parts of our society we're relying on can't be delivered by the non-government sector, what happens in to fill the gap, if you like?
Yeah, look, absolutely. In the main, I think the non-government sector did deliver the services that were needed, but there was very much, obviously, some services such as meals for older people in the local hall had to stop because they would have themselves been exposing people. And so we talked quite a bit about a new type of vulnerability in this crisis, which was the COVID vulnerable. So we have people who are traditionally vulnerable for various reasons that have built up over long periods of time. There's still, as I know that you would understand, Kim, generations of Aboriginal people who are still feeling the effect of the stolen generation, and so therefore they have vulnerabilities and issues that are there pre-COVID. In the start of COVID, we saw two new groups of vulnerable people. One was people who'd suddenly lost their income and had not ever planned for that and lived on paycheck to paycheck. And when that first happened, there was, JobKeeper and JobSeeker were not... Well, JobSeeker originally came out fairly quickly, but JobKeeper was a bit further away. We saw those dole queues. We had people with absolutely no income, and we were getting food relief out, and the sector was getting food relief out in a big way. And there was a lot of effort put into that. There's another group, though, that I would call the COVID socially vulnerable, who were now isolated in their homes. They were particularly older people in the main, but not exclusively. They were told to stay at home because you're unsafe if you go out. They financially are probably, have never had a particular issue. However, they've been cut off from all their social connections and are not necessarily part of the digital age. So go online and do your shopping, sounds fine, but actually is a very complex problem if for someone who's now been told that they have reason to be scared of the world and they have no means to go online and do their shopping. Not to mention the fact you couldn't actually buy anything online for a while there, which was a bit of a problem. I know my mother tried to do an online order and essentially she got back, there's almost nothing in your order that we can actually deliver. So we started to think about what COVID socially vulnerable meant and how to get to those groups. So we had stand-ups like Telecross Ready who were ringing and checking on people and you could register people, but also we were talking to local councils and local community development, our own community development officers about reaching out to connect people who didn't really have anybody else to solve their problems for them and to help them get basic activities done outside of the home and connect those together. There's one other group that it's worth mentioning in this, and I think in our recovery phase, as we start to move, hopefully we are moving to recovery, not to second wave, but over time we'll have recovery. And we do have a group I would think of as COVID disrupted, who are young people who've now, their expectations has just sort of become a very different world. So they've been in casual jobs, or regular jobs where those jobs have disappeared for a bit. They'll probably come back, but they may not come back instantly. And they've also had this generation of young people have potentially not been as enamoured with the career path and the office job, but they have wanted to see the world before climate change destroys it, and they have wanted to be global citizens, and now we've got shut borders and sport's only just restarting and you can't gather and have a party and all of those things are going on. And so how do we include and make a society that includes the young people that are disrupted? So we have older people and young people in this particular pandemic and in our recovery phase that I think we're going to have to really have an eye to what the policies for those groups are.
Oh, it's a good reflection. As you look back, is there anything you would have done differently?
Well, we're putting together a playbook. So we'd have done it faster, I would have hoped, and we'd done it with more, with more idea what we were doing. I think that in the main, there are most things I feel as though we did do fairly well, and the team really pulled together. Many teams really pulled together to do that. We had a lot of learnings in our interactions with health and in our interactions with the State Emergency Centre controllers, all of whom have been given generously of their time to the groups that have met, but just getting personal protective equipment policies written, policies about how you transport people who need to be transported if they've got a cough, all of those sort of things that I think people had talked about pandemics. The 1.5 minute distance rule, I'm told, has been planned in public health for a very long time. in different sort of iterations over years. But to put it into practice, you don't think through every possible scenario. And so we're very much, our COVID team are putting together a manual so that next time we can do it with more rigour and we would have more understanding about who might be affected and how to affect that and change it. And honestly, I've never seen a response from governments across the country like this one. You know, it does seem that everybody became a Keynesian economist overnight. But
That's true.
But it really has been the Australian society sort of stepped up and said, okay, in a crisis, we have a different set of rules about what we care about and how we think money should be distributed in our economy. And that's been really heartening to see. It's actually been quite delightful. So to do anything differently, I think I think we did a lot of communication, but we'd do more. Yeah. So communicate. And I think we should have an earlier eye to some of our working from home staff who became pretty isolated pretty quickly as we started to understand how that works. So I know that a lot of teams were doing daily meetings, and I've had some people say to me as a part-time worker they've never felt so connected.
Yes.
But other people really felt for some time that they didn't know, they'd lost all of their social connections. And we have the technology and the wherewithal to resolve that if we have an eye to it and get it done quicker.
Okay, that makes sense. You were talking earlier about particularly the approach and the challenges that you had around the many groups who are vulnerable people in community that you play a critical role for, and particularly an eye for those who might have been disproportionately disadvantaged during this time, and very much that in crisis, thinking about them, the issues and how to respond, and, soup kitchens, etc., etc. Looking though to the next 3 to 6 months, the crisis isn't necessarily over, but there is this sense of things slowly starting to open up and slowly return to normal. But for many of those individuals, potentially not. But I suspect your response for the next 3 to 6 months might need to be quite different than it was for that immediate crisis piece. So just interested to understand how you're now starting to think and plan and contemplate what the next 6 months looks like.
Certainly we are trying to talk about the way to get as many face-to-face services back and operating because of fears about mental health and disconnection issues that really do need to be taken seriously at this point in time. We know that, and it may seem counterintuitive, but reports of domestic violence and other forms of abuse fell during COVID. And I know that seems counterintuitive, but in actual fact, we would say it's because there's more surveillance. So there is no chance to make the phone call to get out of the situation. And in fact, there's greater stresses in the relationship. So the imminence of violence is more there and more permanent. So we are already seeing, as it loosens up, the first weekend that restrictions loosened up, there was a big bump in calls to the crisis support line for domestic violence. So we will need to have a real eye to those in a crisis like that when we say everybody stay indoors, the very vulnerable potentially disappear. And we've been quite careful to have an eye to that, but there are people we don't know about. And so we will need to plan for how we better deliver those services. We've put I should also mention that our concessions staff have done this incredible job at getting payments out to people who were feeling as though who had no money at various points in time. So we had the cost of living concession boost payment, and we've now had some payments to international students that are coming through our concessions line as well. And I think that there's going to be issues related to tenancy and people paying rent. And obviously there's currently a no evictions situation, but you don't want to end up in positions where people can't ever recover from the rent arrears they've gotten themselves into. So financial counselling services, services that help people get back on their feet and help people find ways back into the workforce. There are jobs in this crisis that may have actually disappeared and never come back in terms of types of jobs, not just jobs, but actual categories of work that may never come back. And so I know there's a lot of work going on in state government headed up by Jim McDowell in terms of that road to recovery and the financial and economic and infrastructure, and Lynn Arnold's heading up a social recovery committee to think through how we get those things together. In terms of our own workforce, I think that I believe there is a real opportunity to take that extra step. I've been involved in the group that, as the feminists of the 80s sort of were talking about access to part-time work when, very, serious male colleagues went, well, that diminishes work as a concept. And, you're actually undermining worker rights was one of the things I was told at one stage. And we've had various goes at flexible work practices, etc. This is the first time we've ever actually seen it happen, in real terms, and certainly in the public sector even more so. Yeah. Sorry, you were going to say something.
I was just going to add, and the opportunity for everyone to have experienced and to actually go, not only can you do it, but you can do it productively. You can engage with people. And I think one of the great opportunities coming out of this will be flexible work opportunities and a rethinking of that whole gender equity opportunity that flexible work does actually create.
I think that's right. My own personal experience, in fact, has been that about 3 days after I was appointed Acting Chief Executive and I was about to host a webinar with the Premier for the NGO sector, I had my father I'd placed my parents in Port Elliot with a month's worth of food and said, don't leave the house. And of course, my father was having a stroke and I was having a debate with the ambulance who wanted to take him to Victor Harbour Hospital. I'm going, no, please take him to Flinders. So our start of COVID meant there was all sorts of rules. Because we'd been interstate, they wouldn't let us in the hospital at various points of time, all of these things going on. And it was really, you got a real sense of what happens to people who are having other crises in the middle of something that's that big. There's less empathy because the risk is so high, less empathy for human tragedy. You're kind of feeling that you need to be there, and then there was a chance that my father may not recover. He's home now, and there's a lot of recovery still to go. But I've been able to, and our house is being renovated, so I actually couldn't live at our house. So I've now been living with my parents and working from home, and actually that's been really useful because as we've gone through aged care assessments, as we've gone through talking to OTs and setting up different things, I've been able to be there and be supportive, which is pre this pandemic, I would not have been able to do that. So I've seen really up close how significantly good that has been for my family, for me to be able to be there, even though I haven't been able to be there the whole time. I'm sitting in another room with the door shut. It just gives you that bit more flexibility. And also, I know that I went to one of our, somewhere in our department, one of the team meetings, and someone just said to me, what we've discovered during this is that we're all grown-ups and we're perfectly capable of managing our workload. And if it's actually about being given tasks rather than time watching, everybody steps up.
Yep.
And I think that there's a tendency with poor leadership or with middle management to think that seeing somebody means that you know whether or not they're working, and that we manage people by presenteeism, as opposed to providing leadership and getting people part of a mission where they can do it when they need to. And I've got a woman telling me that she has a small baby, so now she does a bit of work in the middle of the night when she's up watching the baby, and is able to have some downtime at other times. It makes a real difference, and maybe that connection back into our social lives comes back through our families now as we work our way to a new post-COVID world.
Makes sense. If I thought the job and role was challenging enough through the last few months, as you've just shared there, I've just realised exactly how complicated life must have been. I was going to ask a question about leadership, which seems even more poignant now to ask. you're planning a long holiday, you've got for a whole 2 days, and you've arrived back as an acting chief executive, pandemic, and clearly a lot of things going on outside of work as well. So really interested to hear your reflections about leadership in that time. You know, how did you go about leading your team and all of their challenges and anxieties and things that were being thrown, and what have you learnt about leadership during that time?
Look, having a magic team works, and I reckon I have that. Really helps.
It's always a good start.
Leadership, I've always believed, is about genuinely having. People talk about vision, but I think it's even more about a genuine value-based passion for kind of what you do and where you want to go. Articulating that, letting other people debate it, share it, and shape it. So don't own everything yourself. I mean, there's the leader that's striding out and sort of looking back to see if everybody's following, and then there's leadership that's actually about here's where we need to be, guys. Let's talk about how we do that together. And I think that crisis either brings out the best or the worst of that, because people do go into command and control, and there's definitely a role for that in crisis. There's no doubt about that. Yep. But there's also a role for how do you get people to come along on it. So one of the things I guess has been reinforced for me about leadership is something I've always believed, which is communicate. Talk about it, ask about it, share what you're actually thinking and what the challenges are with people, because that's what makes them prepared to participate. And I think we've seen that right across the country, with chief health officers coming out, with premiers coming out and Prime Minister coming out and stepping up every day and saying, here's where we're at, here's what it means, here's where we're going. And you can see, compared to other crises in the past where people haven't felt that happened, how much people respond to that sense of being part of of solving it together. So we're in this together, which is the theme of Reconciliation Week this week, is actually part of this entire thing. We're in this together, and leadership is about making sure people feel as though they're in whatever your mission is together, I think.
It's interesting as you reflect on that there's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of years about trust and the loss of trust in our institutions, in leadership, etc., from a societal point of view. But this process has required enormous amount of trust, and that trust has often come from communication and transparency. And do you think that has changed? And what do you think will be the upside of that as we come out of?
It's the research shows it's changed. The Australians across the board, so the academic research I've been reading says that the trust has shot up. Trust in institutions, trust in governments, trust in experts, and a general belief that people are trustworthy in our society has actually gone up mega points over the last few weeks. Which is interesting, isn't it? So we've developed a cohesiveness. There's some real social cohesion measures that are going through the roof. I guess what will matter is how we recover as to whether we can maintain that. Yeah, okay. So when you face when the fire's coming at you and you face the crisis, you bond together, you celebrate the heroes and you celebrate the leaders. And then people start to look for who to blame or what went wrong or, all of those sort of issues. And then sometimes the world moves on and people feel as though they've been left behind and forgotten when everybody else is off doing what they were doing before. So whether we're able to maintain that sense of social cohesion, I think will depend on how we jointly all come together and continue, those people who are in positions of leadership, to continue to lead and to talk about being in it together, and not forgetting people along the way, and understanding that there are groups that have sacrificed an awful lot for what we've just achieved. So how do we pay that back collectively?
Yeah, makes sense. You've touched on this a couple of times, but really interested around how you look forward now in terms of the changed operating environment, the things that have been done differently. How do you grab hold of those and go, let's actually make that the way we always do things? Is that something you've started to reflect on? And what are the particular things that you sort of go, I hope this is now actually how we always do things?
Yeah, and it won't happen without planning, because otherwise what will happen very quickly is we will return to where we always were. Because, everybody back in the office, off we go. And change is a very hard thing to maintain. So I have a cartoon that I use for leadership talks that's got a guy sticking coins to a piece of paper that says make change stick, because change just doesn't stick easily. It's one of those things that you can make a change, you can think you've done it, then you go off and do something else and everybody just reverts. So there is planning. There's actually work going on for the whole of government, being led by Irma Ranieri's office, on how do we reimagine our future public sector, how are we doing this, how are we making these things remain. And we in our own department are actually, we're not going to rush back to ways of working that we always have. We've been having conversations online with all of our executive to say, and we're surveying the entire department to say, what changed for you in your working environment in this last few weeks? What was good? What was not great? What could we hold on to? What do you not want to lose? And then we're going to actually mine that data for rebuilding and bring things back based on that, rather than, because it's hard to, everybody's had a different experience. So knowing what each person's goods and bads were will help us try to work out how you shape that. We live in an interesting society generally. It's an agrarian, we still run an agrarian economy where people drive to work at, we all go to work at a certain hour, we all leave work at a certain hour, we have our kids go to school, whatever age they are, in that segment, 9 till 5 kind of thing, or 9 till 3, even though we know that young children do better in the morning and teenagers do better in the afternoon, and we only clog our roads if we all go at the same time. Even though we've always known that for urban city planning, etc., some of that is actually quite illogical, the way we organise work, we continue to do it. This might give us an opportunity to reimagine our cities. What do our cities mean if you haven't got office blocks where everybody's driving to one place at the one time? Do we get better opportunities to have all engage in our kids' sports, or all be involved in celebrating with our teenagers? All of those things, we may actually get to do them differently if we imagine not just the public service, but our entire society imagines work and economic and social contributions in a different way.
I think that's really insightful, but equally the opportunity that presents on a really broad way is quite exciting. Yeah, the challenge is how we grab hold of that. But,
always is.
Yeah, always is. But particularly I think it's great to know that from the public sector's point of view, it's not just, yes, we should think about this. It's actively happening and working on, which I think is fantastic. I say with some hesitation that it feels like we are getting on top of the health crisis, but a recognition that possibly the economic crisis and financial crisis that will have flown from this may not have yet hit its worst. And given the role of the department, interested as to what your key priorities are for the department over the course of the next 6 months, and where your key focus will be.
Yeah, look, it will absolutely remain providing those social services that are necessary in a crisis. So we've got small grants going out to any NGO that needs to refocus the way that it does its business to be able to deal with its clients in this environment. So lots of things about technology and those sort of needs. We are looking at, food relief may well continue to be, we think that's easing up a bit because of JobSeeker and JobKeeper, but there are some groups that are not receiving those payments that we still need to be being aware of. Financial counselling, as I said before, is a very important part for people who've never thought they would find themselves. There are people who literally have had a job since the day they walked down to KFC or something, and have never imagined that they would find themselves unable to find work, and so never planned for that financially. So helping people make it through the financial planning. And that's what's really important, is that we have groups of the community who were vulnerable before COVID, who, as I've said, have the potential of becoming less visible in this crisis and, in fact, more vulnerable, we need to really focus on that ensuring that the people who are now competing for services are getting what they need to move off the needs for social services, so that we can ensure that the services that we have are reaching those that are most in need still. So the focus will absolutely for our department continue to be on supporting the non-government sector to deliver services to the groups it always has, but also to groups that it hasn't traditionally had to do so that we can try to revisit that form of normal, and also making sure that our own services that, we run concessions and we run screening, that they're operating really efficiently, because they're being slammed, or at least concessions is, because they are cogs that kind of help the economy turn, and we need to keep that going. And as I said before, keeping an eye to those people who have been a bit socially isolated, trying to treat to recognise there are new groups of vulnerable and come up with new strategies. So working with local government, etc., to connect people in who've not traditionally had to connect to services.
Yeah. I was thinking earlier when you were describing some of the initiatives you put in place, it's quite a complex ecosystem that supports community and social services. The Department of Human Services is almost in that broader coordinator, conductor kind of role rather than a deliverer of all of those services, but it does deliver many frontline services as well. And a lot of what you've had to do to really get information flowing quickly and efficiently to senior leaders, and both ways, from government to the non-government sector, and learning and getting their intel. Do you think there are things that if you've seen and learnt from that you go, this is actually what we should now bake in, that we should do this all the time to ensure that we're actually all working together rather than actually sometimes working against each other?
Absolutely. I actually was reflecting that the other day, is that it would be a real pity to lose that reference group of chief executives that I've been talking to, and understanding how the sector works together. And it is an ecosystem, as you say. And I think that government in the department may traditionally have been in the role of funder, and in previous iterations a bit big brothery in terms of, the way we funded the sector, etc. And I actually think that isn't the right role, that we should be commissioners and we should be partners, and we need to do that together, because the sector are the people often on the ground. I mean, we have frontline services, but they have more, and we do need to actually treat that as a partnership more, and as a cohesive ecosystem. One of the things that tends to happen in the way that, we run competitive tendering is that we set NGOs up against each other, and we create silos and secrecy. That actually isn't a particularly effective way of delivering community services. It's particularly ineffective in some areas. And what we've learnt recently in our redesign of early intervention services in the child protection space, is that we set up a system where people have no choice but to just refer to each other, because it's not treated as a collective circumstance around a family. Each service only treats one part of the complexity of issues going on for that family, and so there's just this constant referral. If you've got that issue, if you've got drug and alcohol, I can't help you with the mental health. If you've got this, I can't help you with that. If there's violence in the family, I can't help you with parenting. That doesn't make any sense, and so I think to solve that, we need to design that together. When we talk about co-design in government, I know that a lot of the sector shakes its head and says, you don't know what co-design is. I think in recent times we're getting better at it, and I think we have to get better at it, because we have to actually have something that is able to support people in a way that recognises all of who they are and where their social setting is, not just breaks them into a collection of problems or a collection of victims, which I think at times we do. So I would really hope we can. I was trying to envisage the other day, and I've got more thinking to do about it and more consultation obviously to do about it, how we use that Zoom-based forum that we've been doing to go to the next phase of how we operate collectively as a sector rather than a collection of organisations.
That's fantastic. I want to say thank you very much for your time today. I think we've run out of time. We've covered a lot of ground, but but I also, I reflect on the challenges that you've had over the last few months. I want to thank you for your leadership of the department, but also thank all of your team who are doing extraordinary things and a really valuable part of what they contribute to the community and their leadership in the public sector. I recognise all of those challenges and issues, and they're really important issues that your team are working with and confronting. But I sense the optimism and the positivity that you always bring to the table around this is an opportunity to do things differently and think things differently. It wasn't a perfect world beforehand, so let's reimagine the possible about what it might look like going forward.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Lois. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you to PwC for doing this work with IPAA. It's really important. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.